Thank you very much, Eva, for that wonderful introduction. And it's really great to be back here. It's the first time I've seen the exhibition since the launch, and I've been missing it terribly in that time. So it's great to be back. Okay, so in this talk, oops, that's what not to do. Right, in this talk, what I want to do is to look at some of the key ideas that underpin and are worked out through Elliptical Affinities, an exhibition that deliberately links together Irish women's art of the 1980s with more recent and contemporary practice in the context of similar political struggles around reproductive rights and the politics of the body. And it's important to say, I think, as well as Cecily will be talking about afterwards, the artist campaign to repeal the Eighth Amendment was a really important context and catalyst for this exhibition as well. However, I wanted to focus in particular on the significance of ideas of time and temporality. Now, time, I think, is very much a feature of our experience that we generally take for granted, an accepted part of everyday life. But how we understand time, our measure of duration and experience, and how we interpret this is in fact something that is socially and culturally constructed. And in turn, the interpretation of time is also therefore inherently political. What I'm interested in here is how art practice can link to a feminist politics of time and what the implications might be for our understanding of the role of the visual as a place where often complex ideas about identity and being can be explored. And as such, the space of the gallery becomes a location where different ideas of feminist temporality come out to play, intermingling and cross-fertilising connections that viewers make between them. So, what might feminist time look like? Increasingly, as the writer Victoria Browne suggests, feminist time can be thought of in terms that move away from a sense of linear progress, whereby each generation builds on and somehow improves on that in the experience of the past, or regards it solely with a sense of nostalgia. And this is a view that she argues prevents us from grasping the unfinished possibilities of feminisms from earlier times. And I think in this particular context, it's the unfinished possibilities of the struggles around women's reproductive rights in Ireland in the 1980s that are a really important point of reference. Joanne Hayes on trials, as many people will know that this is referring to Joanne Casey, the young woman who was at the centre of the Kerry Babies trial in 1984. Now this in turn suggests ways in which we can connect the work from the 1980s with more recent work as a whole kind of series of unfinished possibilities. And just to look at some of the work in the exhibition in this context, work that deals with ideas of the church and state in this way, the role of the church in controlling and regulating women's sexuality and reproduction in very different ways. Dorothy Cross's Mr. and Mrs. Holy Joe from 1986, and Patricia Hurl's wonderful paintings installed on the altar at High Lanes, which of course is a former Franciscan church, so that significance is particularly apparent. In addition to this, the idea of the acknowledgement and exploration of female desires beyond the regulation of church and state in the work of, very differently, Cathy Prendergast, these great watercolours that just haven't been seen really for such a long time. And we're delighted to have them in the exhibition. And Pauline Cummins' really important, kind of a germinal piece, I think, in a sheer Aran Dance from 1985, which again in very different ways are exploring ideas of sexuality and desire. And of course also the connection with a wider feminist politics, making kinship with other feminist struggles beyond Ireland, Alanna O'Kelly's sound piece, Chant Down Greenham, which is also a part of the exhibition. And if you haven't heard it, make sure you go and hear it afterwards. It's just amazing. Prendergast, these great watercolours that just haven't been seen really for such a long time. And we're delighted to have them in the exhibition. And Pauline Cummins' really important kind of a germinal piece, I think, in a sheer Arran Dance from 1985, which again in very different ways are exploring ideas of sexuality and desire. And of course also the connection with a wider feminist politics, making kinship with other feminist struggles beyond Ireland. Alanna O'Kelly's sound piece, Chant Down Greenham, which is also a part of the exhibition. And if you haven't heard it, make sure you go and hear it afterwards. It's just amazing. Which again makes a kind of a connection between Irish women's body politics and the wider context of feminism, particularly in England at this time, and the struggles around Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp. And I've deliberately put this image up, Leeds Women Refuse Cruise, because I think I am somewhere in that photograph. I'm not entirely sure where, it's my age is trying to work out, but I'm pretty sure I might actually just be off camera, but anyway. And also another really important context at this point as well, because Alanna was working in London a lot at this time, is a group called the Women Artists Action Group that was founded in London and featured people like Alanna O'Kelly and Talontar and Frances Haggerty among its other members. Okay, so moving back to thinking about time, I think it's, again, rather than just thinking of a kind of a linear progression, it might be more useful to think in terms of the plural, recognising that different versions of feminist history can exist at the same time. A range of accounts that validate the different experiences that women have of their lives. But also, what if our sense of time was not always as something moving towards the future, but could loop back and forward across past and present? This multi-directional concept of time means that the past can be experienced as making an active contribution to our experience of the present and is in active dialogue with it. Now, this is similar also to how we might think of art history's relationship between past and present. Modernist histories of art that prevailed for much of the 20th century represented a succession of different modes of art practice as an inevitable drive towards abstraction as an ultimate goal. Now, these have been written about in terms that are highly canonical and selective, generally excluding or marginalising women artists from their pantheon of greatness. Feminist art histories, by comparison, as in, for example, Griselda Pollock's more recent writing, have increasingly embraced ideas of non-linearity as a means of subverting and undermining the discriminatory practices of the canon that silence and contain women, instead opening up the potential for new and productive relationships between past and present that in turn inform a better understanding of our current situation. Now, these ideas of multilinear temporalities can actually be seen as embedded in some of the individual works included in Elliptical Affinities, although they function in very different ways. Louise Walsh's sculptural installation, Hydra in Law, which I'll come back to later, and Jessie Jones' film, The Struggle Against Ourselves, which takes as its kind of starting point the work of Maher in post-revolutionary Russia and his ideas for kind of revolutionary theatre and choreography in the 1920s, where the regulation and disciplining of the body becomes a site of political display and raises questions in a very different way around the relationship between the body and the state. And this kind of lost revolutionary potential of an earlier avant-garde moment is represented in such a way that helps to inform present day, an understanding of present day struggles around the disciplining of the body. So this idea of non-linear feminist art histories is an important context for elliptical affinities. Particularly the notions of femage and the elliptical traverse as a means of giving a meaningful structure to understanding intergenerational connections between women artists. And indeed, both of these terms are in fact derived from earlier precedents. Femage ultimately from American textile artist Miriam Shapiro, and the elliptical traverse from the curator Catherine de Ziegler's major exhibition Inside the Visible in the mid-1990s. Now, I want to look at these terms in a little bit more detail, but first of all, I want to go back to one of those moments where they actually began to take shape and generate, which was actually in a very different place. It was in a journal article that I was asked to write for a journal called Etudes Irlandaises, and it's a special issue on Irish self-portraiture, which kind of raised the question of what self-representation might mean for women artists, and how this might challenge the whole genre of self-portraiture and ultimately the art historical canon. So the essay then turned into an opportunity to write some more about Amanda Coogan. I mean, any opportunity to write about Amanda Coogan, I'm there. And in particular, her work, Snails, after Alice Maher, originally performed in 2010, and here restaged, re-performed at the opening of Elliptical Affinities at High Lanes on the 16th of November. But his documentation and the very deliberate framing of the performer suggested a specific engagement with the protocols of self-portraiture. However, it also suggested a particular engagement with the work of Alice Maher. In particular, Alice's Snails work, the helmet and the double drawing part of her series of Snail Chronicles here. And we were able in High Lanes to display each of Alice's works on each side of the space where Amanda was performing, and which has now been replaced by a video of this performance from the opening as well. It's also a work, Snails after Alice Maher, I think that also bears a particular significance in relation to the then ongoing campaigns around women's reproductive rights in Ireland. The slow passage of the snails across Amanda's body and hair are reminiscent of an earlier image, the snail icon in Frida Kahlo's Henry Ford Hospital, where it signifies the slow progress of her miscarriage in 1932. And indeed, more recently, the slow, painful death of Savita Halapanova in 2012, denied a therapeutic abortion in University Hospital Galway following an incomplete miscarriage. Now, Amanda's configuration of her response to Alice's work seemed to involve both a real kind of sense of respect for the original work and also a very clear sense of affinity. But above all, it suggested a response very much in terms of materiality and embodiment. And this combination became a very important catalyst for thinking about relationships between present and past embedded in art practice, and which it seemed that the existing discourse of art history could not articulate. The words just weren't there to say what needed to be said about this relationship between the work of two women artists. And it's from this that ideas of femage began to germinate. If we are changing our view of history, then sometimes we need to change the language that this is articulated through and actually reimagine the history that feminist practices have been written out of. So femage in this context becomes a cheeky subversion of the term homage, which basically means paying tribute to the status of another influential artist. This is one example, Maurice Denis' homage to Cézanne. This is the entirely the type of thing that we really don't want. You'll notice right in the far right, there's Mrs. Denis, Madame Denis is hidden away there, looking out at the viewer in this way. And it's in some ways this kind of epitomises the way women have been kind of positioned in relation to canonical processes. So my usage of the term femage then is as a means of challenging the kind of the patriarchal relations of dominance and subordination that maintain women artists as both marginalised and silenced. And it's also important as a way of imagining this genealogy, this temporal relationship, as beyond the familial relationships of mothers and daughters. However, the term femage first appears in an essay by Miriam Shapiro and Melissa Maher in the journal Heresies in 1978. Heresies was a significant force in the developing feminist art culture in the United States during its publication in New York between 1977 and 1993. So it's fitting that something with as radical implications as the idea of femage should first be introduced there. The article opens with a range of examples of women's creative practice across a range of different media. And you won't be able to read it on the slide, but actually the whole print run of Heresies is now available on open access. So you can download the whole series and read it. So, you know, for anybody who's looking at feminist history, it's there. So the article opens with a range of examples of women's creative practice across a range of different media, all of which, however, are focused on the bringing together of different materials, recycling and repurposing these into a different format and with a different meaning than originally intended. Many of these practices, however, with their derivation from women's work and experience, become embedded within the notion of collage, identified with a canonical art history of progressive modernism and identified with the work of Browne and Picasso. In their papier-collé works, in particular, domestic in particular, culturally identified as the domain of women, is appropriated within a hermetic language of male innovation. In coining the term femage, then, Shapiro and Maher aimed to reclaim the female identifications that had become detached from processes of assemblage or decoupage or other similar kinds of processes of cutting up and reassembling. So their act of restorative reappropriation also works to subvert the canonical significance of collage, opening up a range of meanings connected to women's lives that might not otherwise be visible. So, femage actually begins its life as a term that applies to processes of production, providing a radical feminist interpretation of strategies of combination as inherent in the making of the artwork. And it's also a term that has a continued currency in more recent writing around craft, for example, around writing around scrapbooks or quilting at the moment. However, I think there's also another relevance, particularly to elliptical affinities, in that femage's earlier significance as salvage and repurposing also surfaces in the exhibition at different points. And these are just some examples, I think, of how the femage as salvage and repurposing emerges, I think, within the different work here. Rachel Fallon's Mother Medals at the top left there, these kind of repurposed and embroidered pot scrubs. The use of the screwdriver and other found objects, and Dorothy Cross's Mr. and Mrs. Holy Joe. And of course, in Louise Walsh's Hydra-in-Law, the paving stones salvaged from the store at Culminating Jail, where they'd originally appeared as part of Outlaw's In-Laws, Louise's installation for the Interstate exhibition at Kilmainham in 1991. Now, Ideas of multilinear time, however, as a feminist project, also have an important precedent, which is Julia Kristeva's essay, Women's Time, from 1979, and which has been highly influential on ways of thinking feminist histories that do not progress in a straight line. Kristeva suggests instead that relationships between generations can be expressed in very different terms, that they can be thought of as actually having a spatial relationship to each other. What she calls a signifying space, somewhere that meaning is produced on all kinds of levels, that cuts through the barriers of time. Now, this is an idea that's actually tantalisingly underdeveloped in Kristeva's essay, Women's Time, where it refers to a metaphorical rather than an actual space. But what if we conceived of the spaces of an art gallery in these terms, as a signifying space of intergenerational dialogue that also cuts across different periods of time? Again, this has been one of the principles that has underpinned elliptical affinities. In proposing a space, then, where different temporalities and related strategies of embodiment could be brought together, the exhibition also aligns itself consciously with another feminist precedent, Inside the Visible, an elliptical traverse of women's art in, of and from the feminine, curated by Catherine de Zager, and which, after its beginnings at a gallery in Flanders, toured to the Whitechapel Gallery in London in 1996, and then subsequently to the United States and Australia. Rather than a continuous chronology, the exhibition brought together 33 artists from three significant periods in history: the 1930s and 40s, the 1960s and 70s, and the 1990s. All times when there has been an upsurge of repressive systems, racism and conservatism, which have tended to marginalise women. And the exhibition focused on how women artists responded to these conditions across a range of different practices and media, and within different locations, and at different times. And de Zager described this process of curating as an excavation of material traces and fragmentary histories, recombined into new stratigraphies or configurations to suggest new meanings and insights of reality. Elliptical Affinities, the exhibition, seeks to do something akin to this in making visible the responses of women artists in Ireland to similar repressive conditions. The act of bringing together two separate historical moments in one space, we intend, reveals not only the specificity of these moments, art in the 1980s, after all, it's very different from art post-millennium, but also brings to light unexpected connections and entanglements between them that in turn suggest new combinations of meaning. So, what might this look like? One instance is the relationship curatorially between Pauline Cummins' slide tape installation Inisheer and Breda Lynch's cyanotype prints, which are displayed on the upper floor of the gallery. So these are not only works that show a kind of a shift across different media, but also different kinds of ideas of the body and how this is actually represented. It's also, in many ways, a kind of a sort of an elliptical traverse from a sense of binary heterosexual desire embodied in Pauline's installation to an idea and exploration of contemporary queer identities in Breda's prints. I'm not saying this is progression, it's a juxtaposition, a kind of a spatial juxtaposition. It's important, I think, to remember that the radical nature of Pauline's work, that kind of outspoken articulation of desires, I think it's still really kind of fresh and immediate with each new viewing. And it's also, as well, that installation also interacts in this way with the trailer for Alice Maher and Aideen Barry's Thick Skin, which is displayed round the corner outside the installation, on the outside of the installation room, where the female gaze focus on the male body in a sheer then becomes juxtaposed with the suggestion of the mutability of the body and the sense of transformation that's embedded within skin. And also finally, I think, on this, I think the way that Pauline's work is also about knitting and making a really important claim and establishing a visibility for knitting as a medium that requires serious attention at this point. It's also something that helps to establish a precedent for Rachel Fallon's Knitted the Assumption elsewhere in the exhibition. Now, other aspects of the way we curate as elliptical affinities also emphasise the multiplicity of temporalities that Victoria Browne talks about, and indeed multi-layered connections across different ways of thinking about time. Intergenerational relationships can also, however, involve continuity, an ongoing relationship with both past and present, and an interaction with the work of artists who appear later. So one artist whose work has consistently engaged with the politics of female embodiment across a shifting range of media and in response to changing conditions is Alice Maher. And in recognition of this, we've included Alice's work as a kind of linear chronology, tracking across both periods, and also as a kind of a touchstone for many works in the exhibition, not just Amanda Coogan's performance. So here we have at the top right, this is the Expulsion, which isn't in High Lanes, but will be in Limerick, and from 1987. Beneath that, The Changeling, a small work on paper from 1988, which in many ways I think kind of anticipates the kind of sense of mutability and transformation in much of the work later in the exhibition. Hecate, above that from 2015, the viscerality of this watercolour with a woman peeling open the surface of her body to reveal its insides. Really, I think, kind of relating, I think, to the kind of the concerns of the campaigns around women's reproductive rights and control of that at the time. Even though it's not directly about that, but again, there's a kind of a resonance there. And also, of course, Thick Skin as well, which we've been able to screen at the art cinemas throughout the duration, on dates throughout the duration of Elliptical Affinities. And yet, despite this kind of linear chronology, there's also points at which Alice's work also interacts elliptically with other work within the exhibition, such as with Cathy Prendergast's work. We have Hecate in these 3 untitled drawings by Cathy in a corner of the exhibition. Other ways in which work can involve kind of complex temporalities as well are, of course, within Louise Walsh's Hydra-in-law. I think where this idea of a kind of a complex sense of temporality across generations is really embedded in the whole structure and concept of the work itself. As I mentioned earlier, Louise had remade her earlier installation, Outlaws In-Laws, which you can see at the top right here from the Interstate exhibition at Kilmainham Jail, where it was a very site-specific work, which was focused then on the then criminalisation of gay and lesbian identities in Ireland, and made specifically for this particular venue. Now, Hydra-in-Law also includes elements of the original work in the paving stones, which you can see in the exhibition space there, which originally appeared in In-Laws and Outlaws. And these again are kind of paving stones, and there's a motif on them of writhing serpents, cast from the motif of snakes on the prison's entrance, and evocative also of a repressed and subversive sexuality. However, in Hydra-in-Law, The binary lesbian and gay identities of the 1991 work, which show a gay couple and a lesbian couple kissing is in the light boxes. These kind of binary identities are, however, reborn in Hydra in law, parthenogenetically as a hybridized tentacular creature, evoking the more expansive fluidity of queer sexualities in contemporary Ireland. I'm sure Louise will talk say a bit more about this later in the round table. It's quite a remarkable work. Hydra in law, however, also interacts elliptically with Patricia Hurl's Madonna on the altar, subverting and challenging the earlier dominance of the church in controlling women's sexuality through the implications of new possibilities of embodiment. But it also suggests a kinship with other contemporary work installed nearby. The post-human themes of Sarah Browne's film, Report to an Academy, which you can just see glimpse through the door there, and the hybridized concerns also of Maher's Helmet. And finally, what also happens to the power of the church in all this that was so important in the 1980s? How does this feature within other kind of elliptical relations? And it just struck me as well that there's that there's different ways in which this can be taken up. The shift from Patricia's work on the altar of High Lanes to Rachel's, and this is the bottom part of Rachel's The Assumption, which is based around the idea of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. This is a shot from the opening. This is actually Rachel and Patricia. And what really struck me was, like, here, rather than the impossible sealed bodies of the saints and the Virgin in kind of Catholic ideology, here instead what you have is this idea of viscerality and the idea of the Assumption being very much connected to the insides of women's bodies. It struck me how kind of intestinal these kind of the ends of Rachel's knitted ladder actually look in this particular, and how that's a major kind of shift from the earlier, and also how in turn this relates to Alice's Hecate on the other side of the gallery. So, an engagement then with different models of temporality can help to articulate relationships between feminist art and political change, and to make visible new entanglements between different instances of art practice. By bringing together a diverse range of contemporary artwork with earlier precedents for the first time, the exhibition makes visible a genealogy of feminist art in Ireland, both in terms of thematic concerns and the increasing diversification of media and practice. And this genealogical turn also works to underline and posit an alternative to the fragmentary nature and discontinuities of women's history. And there's one final point, I think, that needs to be made in relation to the way that this artwork derives its meanings within a broader context, and which can also have the power to inform and challenge, and which has a real urgency, not just within Ireland, but also beyond. At a time when women's reproductive rights are under threat worldwide, and women are increasingly seen as reduced to essentialised biological and maternal roles alone, we need to continue to make a powerful case for a politics and sustained through a range of forms of art practice that actively resists and challenges these attempts at containment. Thank you.